Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Monica Yellowtail, and I'll be hosting this webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to HHS, CY, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at my email, monica@redwind.net. You can also visit our website at redwind.net for additional information on services we provide, upcoming events, resources such as handouts and guidebooks that you can download. This presentation was brought to you in partnership with Redwind Consulting and TLPI. This project is supported by grant number 15 JOVW 21 GK0228 TRIB, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication are those of authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. As this states, this training is part of our Tribal Governments Project. Presenting with us today, I have Kelly Stoner, Heather Torres, and Chia Beetso. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And if there's any technical issues, you can send over a private message to me or Hanovi, and we'll try to get this resolved. I'm going to now turn this over to the presenters.
Thank you, Monica. Welcome, everyone. Good to have you here with us today. My name is Heather Torres. I'm a program director for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. To get to know all of you as we introduce ourselves, if you can drop your name or discipline in the chat, where you're Zooming from, we'd like to get an idea of who's in the virtual Zoom room with us. And from there, we'll start with introductions of ourselves personally, and then a little overview of what we're going to talk about today and a little bit of a recap of part one. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to introduce herself first.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you all for joining us today. This is a very exciting webinar series to us. We have really, I think in the last year or two, really focused on tribal code drafting and incorporating custom and tradition into your codes as you draft or modify those. I'm Kelly Stoner. I'm a victim advocacy legal specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I've been there for almost 11 years now. Before that, I spent 8 years as a tribal judge for the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. I've also been, well, let's say 10 to 15 years a tribal prosecutor for a tribe in North Dakota and some tribes in Oklahoma. And also included in all of that, I taught doctrinal classes at law schools and directed various legal clinics that really focused on victimization issues and domestic violence of Native Americans in Indian country. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chia.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everybody. My name is Chia Halpern Beetso with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I'm a tribal court specialist, and I've been at TLPI for 12 years now, I think. I'm a citizen of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. I'm also descendant Turtle Mountain Ojibwe and Cayuga from the Grand River Reserve in Ontario, Canada. So I just like to thank everybody for joining, and I hope you enjoy our presentation today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chia. Thank you, Kelly. Really honored to be on a panelist with these two. They've been doing work with tribal courts and tribal code development for years. My first exposure was as a law student, and now I'm here at TLPI. I've been with TLPI as a full-time staff for a little over 4 years. I manage our contract work in addition to help create our legally focused publications, which includes a series of many series of legal code development resources, some of which we'll be talking about today. I'm also a citizen of San Alfonso Pueblo and a descendant of the Navajo Nation and Mexican peoples. I grew up here in Southern California, and that's where I'm zooming to you from today, from Yahaviatum territory, better known as the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. And so before we get going, and thank you everyone for dropping where you're from. It's exciting to see all the different folks that are joining us today. As we discussed in part one, TLPI really believes that laws should come from the community. Lawyers are wonderful and essential, but we don't necessarily have all the answers, especially when it comes to effectuating the community's vision for themselves, their futures, and for their safety. So just to put that out there, is that's always our frame of reference. It's about empowerment of tribal communities and creating culturally responsive and specific measures. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump to the next slide, which was an overview of today's presentation. So as you've heard us mention, this is a series. So if you didn't know, there was a part one. Don't worry, there's a recording if you missed it. And there will be a part 3 as well. So this is part 2. We're going to focus on incorporation of tribal custom and tradition. So we're going to talk through how you might be able to incorporate that throughout your code in a specific code provision in a particular statute, go through all those different possibilities, as well as talk about some considerations about where to locate that incorporation, maybe even get into a little bit of a discussion of how do you even identify what is tribal custom or tradition and how it, and why it should be incorporated into code. So we're really looking forward to diving in. I think we've got about an hour and a half today. So please, throughout the presentation, if you'd like to put out questions for us to answer, there's the Q&A function where you can drop a question. We also have the chat box. And as we go through, we'll go ahead and try and answer some of those, but there will be a dedicated time at the end for us to have a little bit more discussion. So no pressure to drop them as we go. We will have that time at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, so recap of part 1. Okay, no worries. So recap of part 1. So we just did kind of some foundational basics in part 1. We talked about what are tribal codes, right? Those are the legally enforceable rules. We talked through about approaches to drafting, some considerations if you're working as a team, some considerations if you've been tossed this project and you're saying, hey, give us a draft code and you're on your own, or you just have another person to talk to, but really talking through the approach and some tips for getting started. We also talked about just generally how code work is such important work, right? It's a way to exercise tribal sovereignty. It's a way to help solve issues in your community. It's a way to help improve responses to violence or to crime. It's such important work, and there's support that you can provide along the way, and people can provide to you, as well as organizations like TLPI or Redwind. We also reviewed some general tips for assessing your tribal code for any gaps that you might see. We provided some general writing tips for drafting, keeping language simple. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about that today in terms of custom and tradition, and possibly including tribal languages in your code as well. And then we reviewed some resources from TLPI, but also reviewed some consideration questions, some baseline questions you might want to ask yourself, like who are you trying to serve by drafting a particular code? What problem are you trying to, or problem or issues or set of issues that you're trying to address? Why are you even trying to address it in your tribal code? And how would you go about doing so? What are your tribe's lawmaking procedures? So it was a really great webinar. We really hope that you can get a chance to check out the recording, and a link to the recording should be dropped in the chat. Anything else to add, Kelly, on that first one?
We just want to reiterate, I know we said this and it's in the recording, not to be afraid to tackle this issue or this task, because no one's perfect when they start drafting, and even the most experienced drafters of laws sometimes have unintended consequences because of the statutes, and that you can always go back in and amend and modify if you find that happening. So to do your best, and then not be afraid to go back, give yourself that space to go back and be able to amend and modify.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. That's a super, super important reminder, because you can have the best of intentions, had as thoughtful of a process as possible, talk to the people you need to talk to, and end up with not exactly what you were hoping for, or unintended harmful consequences. So it's always good to give yourself grace and to give yourself that space to be able to go back and redraft, like you mentioned. So today's conversation, we really want to talk about how culture can be the cornerstone of this type of exercise, drafting codes, drafting policies and procedures, drafting other lawmaking materials. It is a really important and really impactful way to exercise sovereignty, right? Part of being a tribal nation is having that responsibility to protect your citizens, to protect your lands, to protect your families. And so centering culture or keeping culture as a cornerstone can really help ensure that the responses are going to be specific to your tribal community, right? And many of us know this history of interference that's come from federal agencies, from state partners, these pressures that have been on tribal governments, tribal courts. And so now, you know, in this space where we have a lot of resources, a lot of really intelligent folks out there that are really experienced drafters and then you have your community folks who are just so grounded in what's going on in the community and able to identify and think of really creative solutions to get at issues. It's a huge chance to be able to just center those culturally specific values and customs that can be effectuated through a tribal code process. So we're going to really try and focus on that and the opportunities and considerations. Next slide. Okay, so tribal customs and traditions is the cornerstone of tribal codes. Some things to think about. You could set the focus by topic of drafting. So you can think through, again, maybe you did some assessments, maybe there was a specific request by your tribal leadership. Maybe there's a special grant condition that you're trying to meet. Hey, we don't have code on this, it's required. And you're investigating a particular issue. So if you're setting the focus by topic, it can allow for discussions that can really help focus the drafting process. It might be kind of hard and a little bit overwhelming to think like, oh gosh, we need to do a big overhaul of our tribal code, right? Let's narrow that down and let's really think about maybe setting the focus on a particular topic. We've got some listed here. Others you can think of, say, for example, there's an uptick in elder abuse instances in the community. You can kind of take start the process by really getting a focus on by topic. And so, hey, you know what, we're seeing elder abuse as an issue. Let's talk about what we're seeing, what folks are experiencing, what resources are available. And that can really help you then question and ask yourself, well, what does our tribal custom or tradition say? What do our kinship relationships say? How are we supposed to treat elders? How are we supposed to interact with them? What responsibilities does the community have to elders as a vulnerable population in our community? So sometimes by topic is a useful way to think about how you might incorporate tribal custom and tradition. Again, that importance, can't stress it enough, of incorporating tribal custom and tradition really allows you to tailor and get at specific, unique and culturally informed responses to what's happening in the community. If there are issues around, let's stick with the elder abuse example, you can really think through how custom and tradition can offer different protections for elders that may not necessarily be in your tribal codes. Again, and also, you know, with the incorporation of tribal custom and tradition and weaving that into tribal code, it really allows folks to trust in their institutions a little bit more. And that's what when I'm trying to say there is that it really helps build trust in the community and the community trusting the tribal court and tribal leadership, and really seeing that value of protecting tribal elders, respecting tribal elders, and seeing that in code can really reinforce that the court system, the justice system for the tribal community is not just boilerplate, a standard, what you could see in state court. It's actually responsive to the tribal community. And then lastly, how do you think about going about gathering information on tribal customs and traditions? And here we actually wanted to hear from you, and just want to put this in the chat real quick, and maybe we can talk about it and revisit it during the Q&A at the end. But we were wondering to hear from you all about what you think about the question, how do you ascertain what is custom and tradition for your community? And I'm going to repeat that again. How do you ascertain what is custom and tradition for your community? You've decided you want to incorporate more of your tribal values, your customs. How do you go about identifying what is custom and tradition for your community? So again, if some ideas come to mind, please drop it in the chat, and then maybe we can revisit during the Q&A session. But you know, it's important to think about gathering that type of information. Are there chances to visit with, you know, your elder councils or senior program service departments? Are there ways to just connect with storytellers or your culture or language keepers? How might you go about identifying custom and tradition, and what are your resources out there? And then also to guide you, right? What is acceptable to incorporate? I know that's a big worry and concern, and as much as you know, tribal knowledge and tribal knowledge and culture ways have been exposed through exploitative measures in the past. We're very protective, and rightfully so, of our customs and traditions, but are there some, and is there an acceptable way to incorporate some of that into a tribal code? So these are just some thoughts to put in there. We also wanted to uplift one resource, which we'll be mentioning throughout the presentation. It's a video resource guide that's called Listening to the Grandmothers, and it was conversations with elders about creating systems and responses to those victims who are experiencing crime in tribal communities. And so we'll have a link and other resources to share with you about that. But that's a really impactful resource that actually took the approach of visiting with elders to hear and record and document their responses to some questions around responses to victimization. Hallie and Chia, anything else to add on this slide here?
I see some things in the chat that I want to mention to you, Heather, in response to your question. Let's see, the response, how do you decide what is or determine what is custom and tradition? By having an open conversation with general counsel was a response. Talk to people, elders, other groups, cultural storytellers. One participant says, I host a membership engagement every other Tuesday and do surveys for general membership feedback. That might be a method that they would use. All great responses.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. I love that membership engagement and getting together on a regular basis. That's really thoughtful and really builds that community, that sense of community investment, right? So that's wonderful. Thank you all so much. And if other folks are thinking of other things and want to share later, totally okay. Please go ahead and drop them in the chat. Now with this image here, we just wanted to talk about how custom and tradition can really provide guidance for those folks that are interpreting code, like judges, lawyers, attorneys that are representing folks in your tribal court, but also for your community about what behaviors are acceptable and unacceptable. And so we just wanted to share this image with you and really kind of think about how laws or codes, tribal codes, can really be a vessel for enforcement, for protection, for guideposts for interpretation, and really help maintain community safety, community peace, and also just kind of that sense of unity. So just as pottery has a purpose, regalia has a purpose, baskets have a purpose, laws and codes have purpose, right? And I was really struck by this image here, especially with all of the design elements that are featured here on some of this pottery. And to me, it really resonated with the process of developing tribal codes and other materials such as policies and procedures, and how certain code provisions can really be like a symbol or design element that we see in basketry or pottery, which tell us a story, right? So they aren't just beautiful images, right? They're telling a story. So I feel like codes can really function similarly, and can really inform how the overall code should be guided and interpreted. Again, how a particular word is defined, making very clear a community stance. For example, we've seen tribal codes where it flat out says violence is not a tribal value in this community, right? And it will not be, and it will not be tolerated, or however it went on to explain how the community currently holds that value, right? So that's where I wanted to really give us this kind of thought process around how incorporating tribal custom and tradition into a tribal code can really provide us some core guidance that allows the other institutions within the tribal community to be able to be in line with tribal communities or tribal values and customs. So we just wanted to share that with you and offer that as a reflection point. If anyone else has any reflections as they look at this image, please feel free to share those in the chat. And from here, I think I'm going to turn it over to Kelly for some specific examples or thoughts or considerations for where to incorporate tribal custom and tradition.
Thank you, Heather. And I love the pottery image. One of the things that reminds me just now as I was looking at that, and I know we've done this slideshow several times, is that that is very unique to a particular tribe or group of tribes. And that's what we would hope for everyone, is that your tribal codes reflect your unique customs and traditions and beliefs and kinship structures, that they don't look like every other set of tribal codes. I mean, that's one of the things I think that is a pet peeve of mine, not in every situation, because I understand it might be a sovereign decision, but in cases where you see tribal codes that are an exact replica of the state code, it's like someone went, the tribe hired someone to draft codes and they went in and cut and pasted, and just wherever it said state of X, it would put in the tribal name. And that is, again, a sovereign decision, but I would want it to be a decision. I would want tribes to know that there are other avenues, support to making tribal codes very reflective and unique to your unique tribal service area. So a couple of things here. There are many places, let me just say this, many places for you to incorporate custom and tradition in your tribal codes. And I do want to be mindful, Heather, as we move, and Chia, as we move through this, tribes are at various stages, perhaps, in drafting codes. We would go from one extreme, maybe in the PL 280 areas, or maybe in Alaska, where tribes may or may not even have a complete set of codes. And this is the perfect opportunity, prime time, to really start reflecting and making the goal of drafting to reflect the uniqueness of your tribal community. We picked out 3 places that we think are very fertile ground for you to begin to incorporate this custom and tradition. And I'm going to go over a couple of these, and then Chia will go over some, and then Heather will come back in as well. So findings and purpose, I'm going to explain to you what that is and give you a tribal example, not to say that tribal example is the one you should use, but to just give you a tribal example for you to think on, discuss, and then you can determine how you would have addressed the findings of purpose in your tribal community. Then Chia, again, will go over definitions, and then we'll go over the statutes piece of it as well. So let's go to the next slide. Let's go over what findings and purpose are. Now, let me say, as a former tribal judge, I am a non-member of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. They brought me in. It was an honor to be a judge. And I was constantly trying to read their set of tribal codes and understand what it is that the people were asking me to do, since I'm not from that community and I'm not a tribal member. And I was always looking to the findings and purpose section, because in it is such fertile ground for you to ground that tribal judge who may or may not be native, who may or may not be from your community, in what your belief systems, what your goals, what your objectives are, in even drafting this particular piece of a code. So I think this is so important if you're faced with that scenario where not all of your judges are tribal members. I think a solid judicial approach is, I am trying to interpret these statutes on this piece of paper with your purpose in mind. And so let's go over what this is. Findings are simply deciding what's happening in your community. You're identifying an issue that you need to challenge, some behavior you need to challenge. And I always sort of reflect back to children's issues, because that is an area where there are tribal beliefs that are profoundly grounded in custom and tradition, from kinship to what a healthy family might look like, to who raises this child, and all of those sorts of issues. So describe what it is that you need to address. In the child welfare arena, it might be abuse of children, or children are being exposed to domestic violence at alarming rates in your community. Decide what the issue is and what the code, this particular piece of the code, is going to address. Also, I think the findings, as a former tribal judge, I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say, aha, I see what the tribe is wanting to tackle here. This is what the issue the tribe is wanting to address. Perfect opportunity for you to incorporate customs and traditions here. Let me give you a couple of examples. I was a prosecutor for a tribe in North Dakota, and in that capacity, I had a non-native parent arguing with a tribal parent and not wanting to let the tribal grandparents visit. This is in tribal court. So I was able to argue that in that particular culture, the grandparents' rights were equal to that of the parents, because it's in the findings and purpose. Or if it's not there, that I could have called in an expert in the area of tribal customs and traditions for that tribe to talk about that. So much easier if you put it in the findings. Maybe a healthy family is the more relatives that can care for the child, the healthier the child is. And so we were able to actually navigate that and to bring the result of the case in line with what the tribal belief systems were about the child. Another area I think was interesting, and then I'll move on, is customary adoption. That doesn't necessarily take place outside of Indian country, doesn't take place in every tribe. But again, if we go to the findings, and one of the issues you want to address is the adoption of Native children. I can read that. And then as I'm presiding over a case, I can say, oh, but the tribal belief on this issue is here. So I need to interpret these statutes consistently with that finding. The tribe is concerned about their children being adopted out and losing contact or connection with the child. So that was a very interesting experience for me. And in that customary adoption, interestingly, the parents' rights are not terminated, because the tribe didn't believe in ever terminating the parental rights. It didn't mean the child was going to end up with the parents. The parents were always going to be the parents. So if those sorts of issues are important, put it in the finding. What do you see that leads to you drafting these codes? So that's identifying the issue you're trying to address. Maybe it's domestic violence. There's a whole host of issues, but know what's going on in your tribal community and why you need this set of laws. So that's the finding. And if you have questions, you can also put those in the chat if I'm going too quickly. What is the purpose section? So we have the finding. You've identified you want to address, for instance, children exposed to violence. You're finding that has a crippling effect on your children. It's not consistent with custom and tradition, which is, and then you put that in there. We go to the purpose section next, and the purpose is, how are you going to address that finding you just found? how are you going to do that? What will these laws do? And this again is very fertile ground for you to put your customs and traditions in there that you think are permitted to be put in writing in the code. Heather mentioned earlier about violence. Maybe you want to say violence is not acceptable. And we're going to give you an example here, and you're going to see Tulalip, a tribe out of Washington, talk about their findings and purpose, although I think we do purpose and then findings. I think you can do those either way. Just do them, because it is so helpful to a judge looking back, trying to interpret laws consistently with what that community was wanting. Let's go to the next slide. So how do these two work together? You're putting why we need the laws and how the laws are going to address the issue we just identified. So that's why findings and purpose sections are so important. I wish that every set of codes for each segment, you might have juvenile cases, you might have domestic violence cases, you might have criminal cases, each putting in that finding and purpose at the beginning. And remember, if you don't have them now, it's a great time to go back and amend or modify if you think it's appropriate. It describes the existing issues the code will be addressing and how the statutes really should be interpreted. And it provides judges especially, but I would think prosecutors in criminal cases. It should also inform civil attorneys coming into practice in tribal court what the goals and objectives are in a particular code. So context and philosophy for that entire code segment. Next slide, please. So let's look at an example, findings and purpose. Does everybody, if anybody has any questions on what those are, I would like for you to put that in the chat or save it till the end if you want. We're going to go over purpose first because that's the way it's reflected into Tulalip's code. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to pull out pieces that I want you to sort of focus on. Recognizing domestic violence and family violence as serious crimes against the society, the tribes, the family. That's one thing, and that could be considered a finding too. Sometimes you'll see findings and purpose sort of conflated. Doesn't matter, because it is still very helpful to the judge. So as a judge, I would say, okay, tribes really concerned about these crimes. They're really wanting to focus on the victim of domestic violence or family violence. They want maximum protection from further violence, and those who enforce the law are supposed to be reading this and interpreting this as well. And it also is saying the tribe recognizes the strength of the entire tribe is founded on healthy families. So that's telling me as a judge, okay, this is very important to them. Safety of victims is very important to them. And look, especially the children. So any piece of this code section that I interpret, I need, not that I wouldn't anyway, but I'm just saying it's a command really from the people that the children, I'm supposed to go be extra careful and have safety on my mind when I'm thinking about the children. And they want immediate intervention of law enforcement. Prosecutors, heads up. This would be telling me as a prosecutor. They want me to be prosecuting these cases, and they're also very interested in getting the family services. So let's go to the next slide, because this has a lot of information in the purpose. Then we see Tulalip saying, this is the intent. Our official tribal response to domestic violence and family violence shall stress enforcement of the laws to protect the victim and to hold that perpetrator accountable. So as a prosecutor, that's my command. As a judge, I'm supposed to be thinking about that too, reflecting on that when I'm asked to interpret and apply statutes. And that will communicate the Tulalip tribe's policy that violent behavior against intimate partners or family members is criminal behavior. It will not be excused or tolerated. Bold language, very clear there. The tribe is wanting to, and you'll see in the next paragraph, promote the healing of the families where possible and to promote cultural teachings and traditional tribal values. So they didn't put the values in here, but that's a perfect opening that if I, as a judge, need a panel of elders to consult, if I'm not from the tribe and I want to know what the customs and values are, that I can get at that information. And they want to nurture nonviolence and respect within the families. And the very last command, I think, is to the judge. This chapter shall be interpreted and applied to give it the broadest possible scope to carry out these purposes. No question, then. I've got my marching orders as a judge there on how I'm supposed to be interpreting these statutes. All right, let's go to the next slide. And let's look at their findings. Again, you can do purposes and findings together. You can do findings first and then purposes. I don't want you to get hung up on that. So here's what's happening in their tribal community. The statements they're making. Domestic violence, family violence, they're not acceptable and are contrary to Tulalip tribal culture and values, which is honoring the family. And they are contrary to the interest of our community and really the sense of the health of the tribe. I'm paraphrasing here. And again, that command, DV and family violence will not be tolerated. So I'm thinking that's a finding. That issue must be prevalent in their tribal community, and they're ready to address it. And here comes some commands. Next slide. I think we have one more on findings. Okay. And there we go. The tribe, where are we at? Okay. The tribe is also finding, this to me is a pure finding, that DV and family violence imperil the very, to me, survival of the tribal community and the residents of the reservation. And then we get some national findings in here, which you can certainly put. We have all kinds of national findings that led to the Violence Against Women Act 2022, congressional findings, or you could use some of your own community findings, statistics, if you have those. And really, these statistics are talking about how serious the violence against Native women is and continues to be. And the tribe saying a community response to this is necessary because DV and family violence impact the entire tribal community. And here's how that redirection takes place. These crimes redirect tribal resources, whether those are personnel, financial, public safety. It sends them elsewhere and requires an immediate response. And this is impacting the tribal resources. So the tribe says it's necessary to address these issues to the fullest extent permitted by tribal law. And I think those are very strong words. And sort of hopefully you're getting now a feel for what you could put in your findings and your purpose, or if you want to put those two together, because sometimes there is some overlap, that you have some ideas to address that. And if there are no questions, I think I'll turn it over to Chia, and she's going to talk to you about, we're going to leave findings of purpose, we're going into definitions.
Thanks, Kelly. Excuse me. If we could advance to the next slide, please. All right. So definitions. So this presents an opportunity for the tribe to define words or terms within the tribal code. And it's an opportunity to set the record and the tone of how your code will be understood to everyone. So your tribe can exercise its sovereignty and include tribal cultural beliefs into the definitions. So you know, we have the opportunity here to do better than state and local counterparts. And as Kelly mentioned before, that it's, you know, it's a decision to do a cut and paste, but obviously it's, you know, not ideal. And so it doesn't mean you have to throw out what it's been done, you know, at other tribes or what you see in your state counterpart code, but it might help to take a look and see what these definitions are and look at it and think, is, you know, any of this relevant to our tribal community, and what doesn't work or what needs to be improved upon. So Kelly did mention that our colleague Bonnie Claremont, who I believe is on the webinar right now, mentioned in a workshop earlier this week to incorporate as much tribal language and terms as possible into your tribal code and in your definitions. And you can provide the translations and kind of explanations. And if people have questions, they can consult elders or language bearers. But it's really helpful to have that in our tribal codes. So it is helpful to look at what other tribes have written and what they've done. It might look good to you, might spark some ideas as what you might want to write in your tribal code. But as Kelly mentioned, you know, we want to make sure that what we're writing and what we're drafting is relevant to our own community or the community that you're serving. So looking at your tribal code, you want to see, what does this term mean, or what does this crime mean within your tribal community? For example, we're going to look at the definition of domestic violence in the next few slides. So looking at domestic violence, who needs protection, what behaviors are expected, you know, what do we want our tribal citizens to do? How should they be treating each other? What's important in our culture and our community? We want to have, do you want to have safe homes? Do we want to be free from physical abuse, have physical safety, emotional safety, those type of things? What behaviors are not tolerated? And as we saw in the Tulalip Code, there were definitely specific examples of what is not okay and what is not going to be acceptable within our tribal community here. So things like physical abuse, emotional abuse. And I really think it's something that tribes can look at and really make a change from what we see from our state and local counterparts of making the victim have to leave the home, uprooting their life, putting the onus on the victim. This is a great opportunity as you're drafting your tribal codes. How can we protect our victims more? How can we make things easier for their lives, since they're going through a lot of issues that really it's been problematic within dominant culture and outside tribes of putting the onus on the victim. So also thinking about in your definitions, what help can the tribe provide to the perpetrators in terms of breaking cycles, trying to heal? How can we fashion language that can try and bring balance back into our community? And as Kelly mentioned, what do the judge, prosecutors, and defense counsel need to understand when reading this definition within our tribal codes? And also looking at what values need to be realized when we're reading this definition. There's room to be creative here and an opportunity to write the definitions in a way that maybe is frank with the reader. Just put it out there. We don't have to have, you know, language that confuses people, like spell it out. These are our tribal customs, these are our beliefs, and this is what we want for our community. And your community knows what the values are and what's going to work within your community. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at Tulalip's tribal code, as I mentioned, the domestic violence definitions. And I think it's interesting to note that we're looking at a person similarly situated to a spouse in terms of a crime that's been committed by a current former spouse, or someone who shares a child, someone who's cohabitating with or who has cohabitated with the victim as a spouse or intimate partner. And I think here, the goal was to make it broad as possible to include someone who can commit the crime of domestic violence and not try to pigeonhole it. Kelly, is there anything I'm missing here? I know this is a code that we work with often and use, and I know a lot of tribes have looked at this, but I'm not sure if you want to make any comments?
I would just encourage tribes to think broad. I mean, you need really to pull in a tribal victim advocate on this, because what we're seeing, Chia, and remember, as we've been doing our work with the Intertribal Working Group on VAWA 2022, prosecuting crimes against non-Indians for committing certain crimes in Indian country. We really saw the gamut on defining domestic violence. We saw some that required physical violence. We saw some that says violence committed. And so we really know that domestic violence is so much more than physical violence. It could be emotional, it could be financial. This is the opportunity for the tribe to really, whoever's drafting here, to bring in your tribal victim advocates and hear their definition of what domestic violence is. This is like tribal sovereignty in action. You have this blank slate here, tribe. How is this presenting in your tribal community? It can be so much more. You don't have to have a relationship in there either. If you think that it's you want to call domestic violence, it also encompasses maybe family violence. Some tribes are breaking those two apart. So just be creative. I would encourage them to look at lots of tribal examples. I mean, time only permits us to kind of pluck out a few and chat with everybody about it. But again, thinking broadly and getting the input from your tribal victim advocates. And if you don't have tribal victim advocates, tribal coalitions who really train the tribal victim advocates could probably get you lots of information on how you want to define domestic violence.
Perfect. Thanks, Kelly. Next slide, please. So here, this is similar to what Kelly was mentioning, that there's, TLALP lays out here that it can be, domestic violence can take many forms, right? So we're looking at here, manipulation, isolation, coercion, fear, and violence. I think what's key here is those tactics of power and control to maintain that dominance over an intimate partner. And what I think is great here, it doesn't include, it says, but does not include acts of self-defense. So if someone's defending themselves, you know, the idea is that they won't be charged with domestic violence. So here's some examples of what domestic violence may be, but it's not an exhaustive list. So we're looking at any criminal offense defined by Title III, and that is the TLALP Tribal Code of Criminal Offenses and Infractions. So any of those crimes committed against a partner. And harming, harassing, putting somebody in reasonable fear, and also, you know, destruction of property and harm or threat of harm to household pets, because I think we know that that's tends to be a big issue in a lot of domestic violence scenarios. And could we look at the next slide, please? So this further describes what could be an act of domestic violence. So emotional abuse, mental abuse, as Kelly mentioned, economic abuse, causing an intimate partner to engage involuntarily in sexual activity, or preventing the victim from accessing services. Kelly, is there anything else that you want to say about this, the definitions we've been looking at?
I think you're saying it all, but I just want to add and keep stressing how important this is to a tribal judge. As I look to this statute, Chia, and I see, okay, I can see that the tribe wants all of these things to be included in domestic violence, but it also probably needs to have a piece, and I think this one does further down possibly, that says this is including, but this is not an exhausting list, Chia, like you were mentioning earlier, because I, as a tribal judge, am bound to stay within the parameters of your statute. I can't go creating things unless you give me permission to use my discretion. So just kind of thinking about that, if you're making lists of things, you want to be sure that you're thinking about, it's not an exhausted list, okay.
Thanks, Kelly. And I think as you all read, it's pretty straightforward, and I can't speak for the tribe, but I believe, they did participate in the intertribal working group when they were working through some of these definitions before they joined the intertribal working group and exercised VAWA 2013. But I know that they did put a lot of time and thought into their definitions. And again, I can't speak for them, but I imagine they tried to cover these different scenarios that they've seen while prosecuting, what could possibly happen. And as Kelly mentioned, like, judges need to be able to look at this and act on it. And there's a fine line between vagueness and specificity when you're setting up your definitions. And you want to be sure that you can capture the abuse that's occurring, but not so specific that you have to rule something out.
And Chia, excuse me, I would also say, it makes a difference if it's a civil statute where the remedies, the burden of proof is lower. The remedies is usually you do this or you don't do this, or you stop doing this, or you've harmed this person, you owe this much money restitution, as opposed to criminal where someone's freedom is possibly at stake because the statutes are interpreted legally differently. So I'm thinking in a civil statute, I would want you to say, for me, any other remedy the judge feels would bring about an end to the violence. That gives me discretion to listen to my advocate and to tailor each case. In a criminal case, I don't know that you could get away with that much discretion of the judge. Those statutes need to be a little more concrete. And I think we are looking maybe at criminal statutes for Tulalip, I'm not sure, but that makes a difference in the lens that you all will put on to do your drafting.
Thanks, Kelly. Are there any questions from the audience? And Heather, do you have anything that you want to add? And if not, I will turn it over to you if we don't have any questions.
No, I just wanted to uplift the piece that you already pulled out as well, the recognition of other tactics of power and control, and putting that language into the definition of domestic violence, because that to me signifies that the drafters kind of did some education about what goes on in a violent relationship, right? And that helps the community. That's really telling the community that you really want to be focused on the victim and avoid things like victim blaming that can happen in a domestic violence situation, right? Where, oh, the person should have left. Why didn't they leave? Why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they, all those why didn't they questions kind of get nixed by that recognition of that all of these examples that were listed, but also there's more than what is listed, are tactics of a power dynamic that's happening within the relationship between the parties. So I thought that was really powerful and really shows that the community really dug in and thought about what is really happening and how they can address those issues in their codes.
Heather, I think that's such an important point, because I was just thinking, not all judges are educated perhaps in the dynamics of domestic violence. So when the judge is looking back and reading the findings and purpose and looking at the definitions, that can be a teaching tool for a tribal judge. I mean, I can say, it doesn't matter what I believe. This is what the tribe is commanding me to do. And this is the backdrop that I'm supposed to be using when I interpret these statutes. So again, I think the educational piece, maybe we don't always bring that up, but it's super important.
All right, I'll turn it over to Heather now. Next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Chia. Okay, and so we've talked about findings and purpose as an opportunity to incorporate tribal customs and traditions and values. We've now talked about definitions and using that section of code to be able to elaborate and incorporate tribal custom and tradition. Now we're just going to talk really briefly about a specific statute on tribal custom and tradition. Is there some utility there? So again, we could include, this might be an opportunity to articulate and use tribal language to expound upon a particular value that's important to reference or to keep in mind in a statute or a code provision. So we thought about just throwing this out there for you all to consider. And one benefit of something like this is that it can really help with clarity. Like this is what it is. This is how we want our tribal custom and tradition incorporated or not incorporated, or this piece, this one value, this one custom we want to incorporate. And so one of the benefits of having a specific statute that says that is that it's very clear. And so we did provide an example of this as well to just talk through and look at here. So we can go to the next slide. I believe this is from Umatilla, Confederated Tribes of Umatilla community, and they chose to write out a specific provision. So all I mean by provision is that the particular section. So this is a section 10.7, and it talks about how they want customs and traditions to be recognized. And in this particular provision, they are saying they want the customs and traditions of the Confederated Tribes to be encouraged in the application and the interpretation of the family law code. So the tribe has identified a particular topic area, family law, where they want customs and traditions of the tribe to be encouraged in its application and its interpretation. So that's, again, instructions to prosecution, to the judges. And so they laid it out right in a specific code provision. And then this note here is of particular importance as well. And farther down within this section, these sections here that are recognizing custom and tradition, it kind of instructs what happens if there's a conflict or potential conflict between tribal code, what's written in the tribal code, and the customs and traditions of the tribe. And they note that a specific standard of evidence, preponderance of the evidence, must be provided, and notice to all the parties in the case must also be provided. And in addition, it provides some specific instructions for the judge to make written findings on the conflict. So it's a really, I thought this was a really powerful example as well of talking through that sometimes laws and things are in flux, right? Sometimes things are on the books and we may not want them on the books, or they're on the books and they're having unintended consequences. And so this note here that's included in this example we're talking about today really allows for, it kind of extends some grace in that way, but also provides a level of standard of measurement to be able to assure that all the parties are still feeling like they are treated fairly and have the same information, and making sure that everyone in the courtroom, including the parties, are on the same page. Kelly, Chia, anything to add on this particular example?
Well, I wanted to ask a question. Is this the place where I can do that, Heather, or should I wait? And
No, go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, great. So if I could get you all to chat out there on just today at this moment, how would you want a tribal judge to look at the custom and tradition that you have incorporated in your tribal law? Now, let me give you some options. Would you want that tribal judge, would you want to say to the tribal judge, this is law? You go by custom and tradition first, then tribal law, and then if those don't exist, you would go to state law or federal law. Would you want it to be the absolute? Or would you want it to be something like the tribal judge should consider custom and tradition in interpreting tribal law? That gives the judge more discretion. Which one of those do you think? Do you want custom and tradition to be the supreme law? Or do you want it to be a factor the judge looks at when the judge is interpreting tribal law? So could you chat a little bit, for those of you who aren't driving, chat a little bit about that? Or do you even have an opinion on that? Is it going to be just a factor to be considered? Is it going to just be considered if somebody brings it up? Otherwise, we won't look at it. Oh, good. Yes, we're getting some chatting in there. Both say it should be a factor when considering tribal law. And I just, I don't know that I want to judge, especially if they aren't tribal, to interpret traditions. That's a great response. So let me ask you this then. How would, here I am, I'm a tribal judge, a heavily weighted factor. Yes, I agree. Okay, so I'm a tribal judge, and let's say the tribal code says that if somebody raises custom and tradition, that I am to consider that as a factor. And I'm supposed to try, if I can, to incorporate that in my decision. And how will I figure out what custom and tradition is? How will I, as a tribal judge, non-member, not from the community, how will I figure this out?
Yeah, we got some chat responses. Cultural expert witnesses, such as like in ICWA cases.
Love it. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? And there's a conflict, we need to go with culture. If it's conflicting with tribal law, you would want to say that though in your statute. Let me give you some examples. At Seminole, there was to be an elder panel, and it would be comprised, I can't remember how many members, but the court clerk, who is a tribal member and who is from the community, would assemble some elders, and then the judge would meet with those elders privately to sort of have them teach me about how I should be interpreting the statute according to custom and tradition, or traditionally how the matter would have been handled. Okay, that's one way. Expert witnesses, someone said, is another way. I think this is an interesting topic. Let me ask you this. In your tribal communities, does everyone agree on what tribal and custom and tradition is? And I'm thinking of some of the Oklahoma tribes, especially the ones that encompass the entire second largest city of Tulsa. Maybe it's the largest city, I don't know. Many non-Indians there, many folks who might not be traditional, that are tribal but not traditional. How do you go about figuring that out?
Yeah, we got some more responses in the chat, Kelly. Tribal historians, cultural preservation officers. Some folks are looking into an elder panel of judges. Some folks, oh yes, we had some folks pull over and contribute. So we got people excited, Kelly. So there were some major issues that came up when folks wanted to go with customary law, and how that that relationship of customary law trumping written law, and had some political ramifications from that decision. Folks don't always agree, but we have respect to the knowledge that folks have acquired. Yeah, some great considerations here.
So if I'm the tribal judge, then Lisa, I'm going to call you out. I think I want to say hello to you too. If the statute says that I'm supposed to consider custom and tradition, and if tribal law conflicts with custom and tradition, I'm supposed to follow custom and tradition. Okay, that's the scenario I think that you're getting at. It's super important then to say that the judge has to make those findings, and what the judge believed was more, credible evidence of custom and tradition, because it will be appealed. And Lisa's, stating that can be a political firestorm. So definitely flagging that. And maybe you're in a tribal community where everyone agrees it just varies so much. But I want you to think about that, because what do you need the judge to do? To demonstrate how the judge determined what was custom and tradition, if in fact there were disagreements. Consider, Lisa's saying, is a great word. Doesn't trump, but you can consider it. So I think that's super important. If we have just a couple of minutes, Heather, I might give just a few more tribal examples of how other tribes are dealing with this. Do I have like 2 minutes, do you think? Okay.
Yeah, we got plenty of time. We're good.
Okay. Here, I won't give you the name of the tribes, but some tribal examples. One tribe says that the tribal code mandates that the tribal court follow customs and traditions that the court announces. So the judge has to make a finding and then has to put the finding in writing with historical justification. Who the judge listened to, who the judge consulted with about that custom and tradition. Another tribe says the tribal judge is to use customary law, that's the custom and tradition, but only if the customary law doesn't conflict with tribal law. All right, so that's another approach. Yet another tribe says customary law is not a law, but it is a tool of statutory interpretation. It is to guide the judge in interpreting the statute. And finally, let me pick just one more. Here's one that says, because of the tribe's interest in member children, and potential member children, the judge may apply customary law. And it doesn't say in lieu of tribal law, so that's still kind of iffy there. But you get the idea of tribes really taking these statutes that you pointed out, Heather, and giving the judge some direction on, even if you don't want to disclose the custom and tradition, you're just directing the judge, we want you to consider this, and this is how you should go about deciding it, and how you're going to put that in your order.
Thank you, Kelly. And so sorry, it looks like we're having a little bit of technical glitches. I don't know if we want to advance slide or stop sharing for a little bit. Okay, there we go. But yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. I just think that there's a lot to say about naming very clearly in a specific code provision, the encouragement, the may language, the consider language, or if tribes want to go there, there's a really strong value that's just undebatable. That's a decision as well, but those specific code provisions, those specific statutes on customary law can be helpful. It looks like we're still getting some tech issues, at least on my side. I'm seeing the screen flash a little bit, so maybe we can stop share for now, and then we'll stop sharing the slides for now, and then we will talk through some resources. And I think we're going to turn it over to Chia here.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. So briefly, we can go over some of the resources. I'd like to ask Marlon if he can drop all the links into the chat at once so you all can take a look. We do have our home.tlpi.org website, and that lists our publications and web resources. So we have a number of things that might be helpful: tribal legal code resources on domestic violence laws, sex trafficking in Indian country, sharing our stories of survival, as well as some, tribal domestic violence case law. Another resource that Heather discussed earlier is Listen to the Grandmothers, incorporating tradition into contemporary responses to violence against Native women. So there's a video guide and a resource, and I'm sure the PowerPoint will come out to you all later, but we have a QR code as well that you can scan it and get the resource. So it features Native elders and provides a historical overview of violence against Native women, traditional responses to such violence, and analysis on incorporating cultural traditions into contemporary responses. So we have, again, as I mentioned, the video guide and the resource. Another one that might be helpful is the Tribal Legal Code resource for victims' rights, condensed guide for drafting tribal victims' rights codes. So it's designed to assist tribal governments with the development of victims' rights codes, and it was written with the belief that tribal governments have the ability to draft victim rights laws centered on their own tribal beliefs and convey compassion for those harmed by crime and the importance of protecting the rights of victims to prevent re-victimization. And we also have a QR code for that on the PowerPoint as well. And we have a new website, tribalvawa.org, and it was developed as a resource for the Violence Against Women Act Special Tribal Criminal Jurisdiction. And it contains an overview of the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2022, and as well as tribal jurisdiction over non-Indians, categories of criminal conduct under the VAWA 2022, FAQs, news, updates, webinars, resources, events, information for the Intertribal Technical Assistance Working Group, which we encourage all of you to join if you're interested or just thinking about your tribe implementing this VAWA 2022 jurisdiction over non-Indians. And we have more resources on the criminal jurisdiction. We have TLPI resources on the Tribal Court Clearinghouse, as well as a link to the NCAI Tribal VAWA resource website as well. So this is all on the PowerPoint. And I believe that's it for the resources.
Thank you, Chia. And to kind of go reflect back on a question that we asked you all earlier about how do you ascertain what is custom and tradition? There's some really interesting and really powerful information that can be gleaned from listen to the grandmothers. And I know our colleague Bonnie Claremont is on with us, and if she'd like to add anything for the group, I'd like to welcome her to do so because she helped work on that resource. But it's just such a powerful collection of knowledge of elders, and especially when it comes to thinking about responses to violence in the community. As Listen to the Grandmothers was specifically focusing on kind of doing a historical overview of violence against Native women and how might traditional responses might enter themselves or provide clarity or provide insight for how contemporary responses to violence against Native women should be. And there's just some really powerful resources that and tidbits that come out of that publication. And in particular, there's this one pager that kind of just talks about what are some general steps to incorporating traditional practices into contemporary responses to violence against women, with a note, of course, that not all of these steps may be useful. But thinking about that question of how do we ascertain tribal custom and tradition, some of you named some of these steps here that I think are really impactful. Talking, right? Step one, talk. Interview elders in your community who have an interest in the community or interest in the issue. Ask for permission to record their thoughts, and questions used for the video that you're going to be using for the video can be thought of together with your team. Step two, research. Maybe your tribal librarian or your tribal historian has some information. Folks have mentioned cultural preservation officers. There might even be books or articles written by trusted community sociologists, anthropologists. And so there's a lot of really good information that be collected to help inform that question of what is a custom, a tradition, or a value. Step three that's outlined there is listen. So if you're trying to pass a code for the protection of elders, for example, going back to my elder abuse example, talk with survivors if they're ready, if they're in a place in their journey to share, and to really try and think about that who that you're trying to protect with your code, and seeing if there's a way to include their voices in the drafting. There's also another step outlined is reviewing and comparing, looking at existing tribal laws. And then these are getting more broadly into just the code development process or the response creation protocol policy piece of it, but reviewing and comparing. And then also, the fifth step outline on this one pager is education and publication and community, creating publications and educational resources to get at sharing and building up that community awareness of an issue, right? So I think about the Tulalip example where we just went through their definition of domestic violence, and it outlined that, or it pulled out those words of power and control, right, which are used to interpret. There, it's pulled up here. Perfect, thank you. And that how an understanding of power dynamics within the realm of domestic violence is super important to ensure that not only that services are victim-centered, but also to just acknowledge that those power dynamics are at play. So it's a really, again, a really powerful tool. And I wonder if there was any education around domestic violence that accompanied the creation of that code, or even with the development of code within your process of outlining not only how the code is going to be drafted, but how are you going to get the word out to the community about the code drafting process, about the new laws that are in place. Is there some education and awareness that can be done through posters, flyers, brochures that can help raise the community awareness of the new code as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm pulled up my chat now. Sorry, Bonnie, that you can't hop on. I don't know if you want to offer any tidbits in the chat, but it's just a really powerful resource that really featured elders' knowledge and their wisdom in a really unique way, and really showed that it is possible to have these conversations. It is possible for culture and tradition to be weaved into every part of a system of governance and care. So anyway, I'm talking a little too much now, and I think we've got a few minutes left. So if there are any questions for us, we can feel free to take them at this time. And Marlon, if you can just pull up the slide with our emails in case folks want to reach us.
Heather, can I add one thing? This happened to me when I was representing in a civil case in tribal court. And I want you all to just kind of think about this, because this is an example to me of how the Western system doesn't flow with the tribal system oftentimes. And in that case, I was trying to get at custom and tradition. And to do so, it was recommended to me that I needed to call an elder who was a spiritual elder in long standing in the community. And so I had arranged for the elder to be there, and he was waiting patiently. And when I announced that he's there and I'm going to call him as an expert witness on custom and tradition, I was really trying to get at the grandparents and the parents have equal rights. One is not higher than the other in that community. The opposing counsel promptly tells me, well, first of all, he was very dramatic and he threw his notebook on the table and said, the parents' rights are fundamental according to the U.S. Constitution, which we know doesn't apply there, but he didn't get that memo. And then he wanted to put that elder, that spiritual elder, on the stand and cross-examine him. That is not okay. That is a huge respect issue, very inappropriate in that particular community. So I want you all to think about that too, because that Western system wants to kick in, well, if you're going to bring somebody, I'm going to cross-examine. So you might want to think about addressing that in when you're doing the custom and tradition and how that's going to factor in, that however you're going to navigate that, the elders do not get subjected to cross-exam, which in the hands of some lawyers is very disrespectful. It's fast, it's aggressive, it's totally inappropriate. So think about that and how you would handle that to kind of circumvent that kind of issue happening.
Kelly, can you share how that turned out? How'd you handle that?
I'm going to say that it was divine intervention, because I was not going to let that happen. And the tribal judge, who was a tribal member of that community, stood up and said, you know, I will talk to this elder. You both sit down and if you have a question, you can give it to me in writing and I will decide whether it's going to be asked or not. And then the other side just decided that they weren't going to cross-examine. Well, the judge wasn't going to let them anyway. So, but if we would have had something in writing there saying that the judge could hear from the elder in private, or the attorneys could be present, but we can't be disruptive, and we're going to hand these questions on the paper to the judge, and the judge will decide what gets asked and what's appropriate. We need some parameters there, but we did win the case. So yeah, it did turn out well.
Oh, geez, thanks for sharing. I just can't. Cross-examination of an elder. That's, wow. It's a lot to chew on there. Okay, with that, I think we've covered all of our intended materials for today's presentation. Thank you for joining us. It seems like we had like a host of just very impressive folks today, like looking at the introductions and, you know, folks that were able to share along the way here. Thank you so much for taking the time. There will be a part 3 in our webinar series, so keep an eye out for communications from Redwind. You can also sign up for TLPI's listserv to get announcements as well. Marlon here has pulled up the evaluation for today's presentation, so you can either scan the QR code here, or I think we're also planning to drop the link in the chat but we really do take to heart the feedback that we all get from you all. And we really try to keep that in mind in the next, in our next go around. So we highly appreciate your feedback and to hear from you on how you think today's presentation went. And with that, I think we have about 10 minutes of the scheduled time available. But if no one has any questions, we can end early and folks can get back those 10 minutes of their day. But we just don't want to close out if folks are still having questions or thoughts. So please feel free to share those in the chat. Oh, yes, thank you. I'm glad you found it informative and helpful. We really, like Kelly said, we're getting really focused on this because I think it's just ripe for work to be done, especially if tribes are considering exercising special tribal criminal jurisdiction. There's just a whole host of opportunity in code drafting, and we're excited to put out information and resources for you all to consider. Okay, I think we've got a question. Let's see. Okay, I think it's incoming. There we go. Okay, so the question is, do tribal courts need an approval from a government agency to start hearing cases? Kelly, I'll open it up for you.
Well, I'm going to say most likely no. But if you are a tribal, I believe it's tribal jurisdictional grantee from the office, I think, or maybe it's an OVW grant from the Office of Violence Against Women. I think in order to start hearing some VAWA 2022 cases, because you receive federal grant money, you have to go through some hoops. Tribes that don't have that restriction, they do not need permission. I will share with you though, when VAWA 2013 came out, very first time since 1978, tribes are beginning to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. The 5 pilot tribes, Tulalip was one of them, had to have their tribal codes approved that they were going to use to prosecute these non-Indians. They had to be approved by the Department of Justice. But since that period expires, tribes decide when they're ready and whether they can meet the requirements to exercise this criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians in Indian country. Hope that answered. Unless you have a grant restriction, I guess we'll say you don't have to get permission. Most likely. Don't box me in. I'm a lawyer. Most likely.
Most likely. There we go. And if there are any questions, because I know, through this partnership with Redwind, we are providing this webinar series with funds from support from OVW. So if there are any questions like that, or if you would like to have more one-on-one technical training or technical assistance, please reach out to Redwind, who will reach out to us, and we'll coordinate on how we might be able to get at your needs. So thank you again so much to everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in part 3.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Before we end the session, for those that didn't fill it out from the chat, there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. Part 3 of the series will be taking place on November 3rd at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, so that's November 3rd. And as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto Redwind's YouTube channel within the next few days. You can also find previous recordings there. And as also Heather mentioned earlier, part 1 of this series is on there as well. In closing, I'd like to thank you, all of our wonderful presenters, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.